At a small county fair auction in rural Nebraska, 7-year-old Emma Wilson stood clutching her pink piggy bank as the auctioneer rapidly called out increasing bids. Her eyes were fixed on an aging German shepherd with cloudy eyes and a noticeable limp, wearing a tattered service vest that had clearly seen better days. When Emma finally emptied her entire life savings of 57 to 38 onto the auction table to save the struggling animal, no one could have predicted the extraordinary chain of events that would follow. Because this wasn't just any service dog, he was a messenger, carrying a story of sacrifice and heroism that would reunite broken lives and heal wounds that medicine couldn't touch. Before we continue this remarkable journey, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's video reveals something truly special that you won't want to miss. The morning sun cast long shadows across Meadowbrook County Fairgrounds as locals gathered for the annual summer auction. Colorful banners fluttered in the gentle breeze. Food vendors prepared their stalls for the day ahead, and the dull roar of friendly conversation filled the air. For most attendees, it was simply another community event, a place to find bargains, meet neighbors, and enjoy homemade lemonade under the shade of ancient oak trees. For Emma Wilson, however, this particular Saturday in July represented something monumentally important. The precocious second grader with untamable curly red hair and a constellation of freckles across her nose had been saving her allowance, birthday money, and neighborhood lemonade stand earnings for exactly 347 days. Her original goal had been a purple bicycle with streamers on the handlebars from Watson's hardware store. But plans had changed dramatically 2 days earlier when her father, Thomas Wilson, had taken her to the fairgrounds to preview the auction. "Items? Daddy, what's wrong with that dog?" Emma had asked, pointing toward a kennel partially hidden behind stacked furniture and boxes of household items. Thomas had approached cautiously, his daughter's small hand clutched in his own, to find a German shepherd lying quietly on a thin blanket. The dog's muzzle showed significant graying, and one rear leg was noticeably thinner than the others. Most striking, however, was the faded service dog vest still fastened around his chest, patches indicating military service partially visible beneath stains and wear. "He looks sad," Emma had whispered, kneeling by the kennel. The dog had lifted, his head slightly cloudy eyes finding hers with a quiet dignity that belied his current circumstances. "Where did he come from?" Thomas had asked Jerry Simmons, the auction coordinator who'd approached when he noticed their interest. "Estate clearance from outside of town," Jerry had explained, shaking his head. "Owner passed away suddenly last month. No family stepped forward for the dog. Vet says he's about 10 years old, has some arthritis and cataract starting. Service trained but retired. He'll be in Saturday's auction, but honestly," he'd lowered his voice, not expecting much interest given his condition and age. The memory of those sad eyes had haunted Emma for the next 2 days. She'd announced at dinner that evening that she had changed her mind about the bicycle. When her parents asked why, her answer had been delivered with the absolute conviction only a 7-year-old can muster. "That dog needs me more than I need a bike." Initially, Rebecca and Thomas Wilson had tried to reason with their daughter. A senior dog with health issues would be expensive and heartbreaking, they explained. Perhaps they could donate to the animal shelter instead. But Emma had remained resolute, her small jaw set with determination as she carried her piggy bank to her room and counted its contents for the 20th time. Now, standing in the growing crowd at the auction with her father beside her, Emma clutched that same piggy bank, a ceramic unicorn with a rainbow mane, while anxiously waiting for lot 37, listed simply as Adult German Shepherd, Service Trained. Thomas Wilson watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. At 42, the high school history teacher and soccer coach had always encouraged Emma's compassionate nature, but he worried about the inevitable heartbreak that would come with an elderly, ailing dog. Rebecca, a pediatric nurse at County Memorial Hospital, had been called into work for an emergency shift, leaving Thomas to navigate this situation alone. "Emma, honey," he said gently, kneeling to meet her eye level. "Remember what we talked about. The doggy might go to someone else today, and that's okay. He might need special care we can't provide." Emma nodded solemnly, but her fingers tightened. Around her piggy bank. "I know, Daddy, but I have to try. I just have to." The auction proceeded efficiently through garden equipment, furniture, and household goods. Emma paid little attention until the auctioneer, a portly man with a booming voice and red suspenders, announced, "Next up, folks, we have Lot 37, one adult German Shepherd, approximately 10 years old, previously trained as a service animal. Comes with kennel, some food, and basic supplies. Who'll start the bidding at $50? An uncomfortable silence fell over the crowd. From his kennel near the auction platform, the German Shepherd watched the proceedings with alert ears, but made no sound. His dignified posture seemed at odds with his circumstances, sitting tall despite his obvious discomfort. "Folks, this is a trained service animal," the auctioneer prompted when no bids came forward. "How about 40? 30? $20? Called a gruff voice from the back, a local farmer who was known for taking in working dogs. Emma looked up at her father with panic in her eyes. Before Thomas could respond, a woman in a denim jacket raised her hand. 25, 30, Emma suddenly shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. The crowd parted slightly, many heads turning to find the source of the childish voice. The auctioneer spotted Emma and smiled kindly. "I have 30 from the young lady in the front. Do I hear 35? 35, countered the farmer without enthusiasm. 40, Emma called out, clutching her piggy bank tighter. The bidding continued, with Emma raising her hand with increasing desperation each time she was outbid. When the price reached $50, nearly the entirety of her savings, Thomas placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, concern etched on his face. "That's all my money, plus a little more, sweetheart," he whispered. "I think we need to let this go." "I have 50 from the young lady," the auctioneer announced. "Do I hear 55? A tense moment passed. The farmer shook his head and turned away. The woman in denim hesitated, glanced at Emma's determined face, and then lowered her hand without bidding. 50 going once, going twice. 55. Called a new voice, crisp, authoritative, from a man standing at the edge of the crowd. He wore aviator sunglasses and a leather jacket despite the summer heat, his military bearing evident even from a distance. Emma's face crumpled. Thomas knelt beside her, arm around her small shoulders, as tears began to well in her eyes. 60, she shouted desperately, opening her piggy bank, despite knowing it contained less than that amount. The man in sunglasses turned toward her voice, his expression unreadable behind his glasses. He took a step forward, then stopped, watching as Emma dumped her entire savings, a collection of crumpled bills and coins, onto the auction table. "I have..." She began counting frantically. $57.38. Her voice broke as she looked up at the auctioneer. "Plus I'll do chores. Please, he needs me." A hush fell over the crowd. The German Shepherd had risen. In his kennel, his attention now fully focused on the small, red-headed girl at the auction table. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, no one spoke. Then the man in sunglasses removed them slowly, revealing a face marked by a jagged scar running from temple to jaw on the left side. "I withdraw my bid," he said quietly. The auctioneer looked between the man and the little girl with her pile of savings. Understanding passed between the adults. "Sold to the young lady for $57.38. A spontaneous applause broke out among the crowd. Emma stood frozen in disbelief until her father gently nudged her. "You did it, Em." As Thomas helped the auction staff complete the paperwork, Emma approached the kennel where the German Shepherd waited. Kneeling in front of the wire door, she whispered, "Hi, I'm Emma. You're coming home with me." The dog studied her for a long moment before slowly extending his muzzle through the wire to gently touch her outstretched hand, a gesture of such deliberate gentleness that several onlookers commented on it later. While Thomas loaded the dog's supplies into their station wagon, Emma sat beside the kennel, talking softly to her new companion. "What's your name, boy?" she asked, noticing there was no collar with identification tags. "His name is Sergeant," came a deep voice behind her. Emma turned to find the man in the leather jacket standing a few feet away, sunglasses now hanging from his shirt pocket, his scarred face fully visible. At least, that's what his handler called him. Emma looked up at the stranger with curiosity rather than fear. "How do you know?" The man knelt down, keeping a respectful distance from both girl and dog. "Because I served with his handler in Afghanistan, Marine Corps, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines." His gaze shifted to the dog, who had gone completely still, ears forward, attention locked onto the man's face with an intensity that seemed impossible given his clouded eyes. You know him?" Emma asked, glancing between the dog and the man. "I knew him," the man corrected gently. "It's been a long time." He extended a hand slowly toward the kennel. The German shepherd sniffed cautiously, then pressed his nose against the man's fingers in what appeared to be recognition. Thomas Wilson approached, protective father instincts kicking in at the sight of a stranger talking to his daughter. "Everything okay here?" The man stood, offering his hand. "Captain Marcus Delgado, sir, former Marine Corps. I was just telling your daughter that I recognized this dog from my service days." Thomas shook his hand warily. "Thomas Wilson, this is my daughter, Emma." "Mr. Wilson, I don't mean to intrude, but may I ask where this dog came from?" "The auction listing." Thomas explained the limited information they'd received, the estate clearance, the deceased owner with no family to claim the dog. Captain Delgado nodded slowly, his expression troubled. "The name on the estate, was it Hammond? Robert Hammond?" Thomas looked surprised. "I believe so, yes. Did you know him?" "I've been looking for him for 3 years, Delgado said quietly. "For the dog, actually, and to deliver something important." He knelt again, this time addressing the German shepherd directly. "Sergeant, it's been a long time, boy." The dog's tail moved slightly, not quite a wag, but a clear acknowledgement. Emma looked between the adults, sensing the gravity of the situation despite her young age. "Is Sergeant your dog?" she asked Captain Delgado, her voice small and slightly fearful. Delgado shook his head. "No, he's not mine. And it seems he's yours now." He stood again, addressing Thomas. "Mr. Wilson, I know this is unusual, but I'd like to ask a favor. I have some information about this dog, about his history and his former handler, that I believe your family should know. Would it be possible for me to visit once you've had a chance to get him settled in your home?" Thomas hesitated, understandably cautious about inviting a stranger to their house. "Perhaps we could meet somewhere public first. The coffee shop in town, maybe." "Of course," Delgado agreed immediately. "I understand your concern. Tomorrow morning at Riverside Coffee, say around 10, they exchanged phone numbers, and Captain Delgado gave one last look at the German shepherd. "Take good care of him," he told Emma, with unexpected emotion in his voice. "He's a very special dog." As the Wilsons drove home with their new family, members secured in the back of their station wagon, Emma couldn't stop looking over her shoulder at Sergeant, who sat with dignified composure despite the car's movements, aggravating his arthritic joints. "Daddy, why did that man know our dog?" she asked. Thomas glanced in the rearview mirror at the German shepherd. "I'm not sure, sweetheart, but it seems Sergeant here might have quite a story to tell." They couldn't possibly know, as they drove through the quiet streets of their small town, that this elderly service dog would soon connect their lives to a tale of heroism, sacrifice, and an unfinished mission that had waited years for completion. Nor could they guess that Emma's impulsive act of compassion would set in motion events that would heal wounds far deeper than Sargent's physical ailments. Wounds that belonged to people she had yet to meet. Rebecca Wilson was waiting on the front porch of their modest two-story home when they arrived. Her hospital shift having ended early, her expression shifted from curiosity to concern as Thomas helped the aging German Shepherd from the vehicle. "Oh, Thomas," she sighed, taking in the dog's condition. "When you texted that Emma had actually won the auction, I didn't realize." "He's perfect, Mommy," Emma declared, rushing ahead to take her mother's hand. "His name is Sargent, and he's a hero dog." Rebecca knelt to her daughter's level, tucking a stray red curl behind Emma's ear. "A hero dog, huh?" She glanced at her husband with questions in her eyes, but softened at Emma's enthusiasm. As a pediatric nurse, Rebecca understood the healing power of animals for children. Still, the German Shepherd's condition concerned her professional instincts. "Let's get him inside and comfortable," Thomas suggested, guiding Sargent up the 3 porch steps. The dog navigated them slowly but with determination, refusing Thomas's attempt to support his hindquarters. Even in his compromised state, the service animal maintained a quiet dignity that impressed both adults. Inside, Emma had already prepared a space in the living room, having insisted they stop at Watson's Hardware on the way home to purchase a large orthopedic dog bed with her father's help. She'd positioned it carefully in the corner with good sight lines to both the front door and the hallway leading to bedrooms. A placement that Thomas now realized seemed deliberately strategic rather than random. "Water first," Rebecca instructed, her nurse's training taking over as she assessed their new family member. She filled a large bowl while Thomas brought in the supplies from the car. Sargent approached the water cautiously, waiting until Emma gave an encouraging nod before drinking. His manners were impeccable, taking just enough to quench his thirst before retreating to the new bed, where he settled with a quiet sigh that seemed to contain both pain and relief. "He needs a bath and probably a vet visit," Rebecca whispered to Thomas as they watched Emma sit cross-legged beside the dog, already chatting away about her room, her school, and all the places they would go together. "There's more," Thomas murmured, keeping his voice low. He briefly explained their encounter with Captain Delgado, the mention of Afghanistan, and the planned meeting tomorrow. Rebecca's expression grew concerned. "You're meeting a stranger because he claims to know the dog from military service?" "Thomas, that sounds—" "I know how it sounds," he interrupted gently. "That's why we're meeting in public. But Becca, you should have seen how the dog responded to him, and the way he spoke about the dog's former handler." Thomas paused, watching Emma gently stroke Sargent's graying muzzle. "I think there's a story here that might be important." Before Rebecca could respond, Emma called out, "Mum, can Sargent sleep in my room? Please, I promise I'll take care of everything." Rebecca exchanged glances with Thomas. "Let's see how tonight goes first, sweetheart. Sargent might feel more comfortable down here until he gets used to his new home." Emma looked disappointed but nodded. "Okay, but I'm going to read him a bedtime story anyway." She was already pulling books from the shelf, considering which might be best for a dog who had seen war. That evening passed in a flurry of preparations. Rebecca, despite her initial reservations, found herself thoroughly examining Sargent with gentle hands, cataloguing his various ailments with professional detachment that gradually gave way to genuine concern. The arthritis in his hips was pronounced, his vision clearly compromised by advancing cataracts, and several old scars spoke of past injuries. Most worrying to her was his thin frame. not quite emaciated, but showing signs of recent weight. Loss typical in elderly dogs whose owners could no longer provide proper care. "We'll need to schedule a full veterinary workup," she told Thomas as they prepared dinner. "He's in better shape than he could be, considering, but there are definitely issues that need addressing." At the table, Emma could hardly eat, too busy dividing her attention between her own plate and Sergeant, who lay on his new bed watching the family with alert interest. Every few minutes, she slipped from her chair to offer him gentle touches, or whispered encouragements. "Emma, honey, eat your dinner," Rebecca reminded her gently. "Sergeant is fine. He's watching the doors and windows," Emma observed with surprising insight. "That's what he was trained to do, right? To protect people?" Thomas considered his daughter's observation. She was right. The dog maintained a subtle but consistent awareness of the home's entry points, his rest periodically interrupted by a quiet assessment of his surroundings. "Service dogs are trained to be alert to their handlers' needs," Thomas explained, recalling what little he knew about military working dogs. "But Sergeant is retired now. His job is just to be a pet." Emma shook her head with the absolute certainty of childhood. "He doesn't know he's retired. Look at his eyes, Dad. He's still working." After dinner, while Rebecca cleaned up the kitchen, Thomas took Sergeant into the backyard. The German Shepherd moved carefully but with purpose, systematically investigating the fenced perimeter of their modest yard with professional thoroughness. Thomas observed this ritual with growing fascination, recognizing it wasn't random exploration, but a security sweep performed by muscle memory. When Sergeant finally returned to Thomas's side, he sat at perfect attention, despite the obvious discomfort in his joints. "At ease, soldier," Thomas said softly, feeling slightly foolish for saying it, but compelled by some instinct he couldn't name. To his astonishment, Sergeant immediately relaxed his posture, leaning slightly against Thomas's leg. In a gesture that seemed both grateful and deliberate, bedtime proved challenging. As predicted, Emma insisted on Sergeant coming upstairs, while Rebecca maintained it would be better for everyone if the dog remained downstairs for the first night. The compromise was 15 minutes of bedtime stories in Emma's room before. Sergeant would return to his bed downstairs. Emma sat on her pink and purple quilt. Sergeant settled beside her bed as she read from Charlotte's Web, with careful pronunciation of the bigger words. The dog's attention never wavered from her voice. His eyes, cloudy though they were, fixed on her small face with an intensity that struck Thomas as he watched from the doorway. "Time to take Sergeant downstairs," he said when the 15 minutes had passed. Emma closed the book reluctantly. "But he likes the story." "We can continue tomorrow," Thomas promised. "Sergeant needs his rest too." To their surprise, when Thomas patted his leg to call Sergeant, the dog didn't move. Instead, he looked from Thomas to Emma, then deliberately settled his chin on the edge of her mattress. "See? He wants to stay with me," Emma declared triumphantly. Rebecca appeared in the doorway, her expression softening at the tableau before her. "Just for tonight," she conceded. "But if there are any problems, he comes right downstairs." No problems arose. When Thomas checked on them an hour later, he found his daughter fast asleep with one hand resting on Sergeant's head. The dog was awake, his position calculated to allow him to face the bedroom door while remaining in contact with Emma. When he saw Thomas, his tail moved in brief acknowledgement, but he made no effort to move from his self-appointed post. "Guarding duty." "Huh?" Thomas whispered. Sergeant blinked once, slowly, which Thomas chose to interpret as confirmation. Morning brought new revelations. Rebecca discovered Sergeant could open the refrigerator door when properly motivated by the scent of leftover chicken. Emma found he responded instantly to hand signals she hadn't taught him. And Thomas, taking the dog out for a morning bathroom break, noticed how Sergeant positioned himself between approaching neighborhood dogs and the house where Emma was eating breakfast. A subtle but unmistakable protective stance. At 9:30, Thomas prepared to leave for his meeting with Captain Delgado. He'd arranged for Rebecca to take a late shift at the hospital, allowing her to stay home with Emma and Sergeant. "I still think this is unusual," Rebecca said, as she helped him find his wallet. "Meeting a stranger because he claims to know our dog?" "Our dog, who was a military service animal and is clearly highly trained," Thomas reminded her. "I'm curious, Becca. Something about this whole situation feels significant." He kissed her goodbye. "I'll call you right after." Riverside Coffee occupied a converted Victorian house in the center of town, its wraparound porch filled with mismatched furniture and hanging plants. Thomas arrived early, selecting a table with good visibility of both the entrance and the street, a precaution that felt silly in the morning sunshine, but one he took nonetheless. Captain Delgado arrived precisely at 10, now dressed in civilian clothes, dark jeans and a button-down shirt that did little to disguise his military bearing. The scar on his face drew a few curious glances from other patrons, but his confident posture and direct gaze typically redirected their attention elsewhere. "Mr. Wilson," he greeted Thomas, extending his hand. "Thank you for meeting me." They ordered coffee, making brief small talk about the weather and the town until their drinks arrived. Then Delgado's expression grew serious. "How is Sergeant adjusting?" Thomas smiled despite himself. "Remarkably well. He's appointed himself my daughter's personal guardian. Barely leaves her side." Delgado nodded, unsurprised. Protective instinct. That was his specialty. He took a sip of his black coffee before continuing. "Mr. Wilson, what I'm about to tell you might sound unusual, but I believe you and your family should know Sergeant's history, especially now that he's become part of your household." Thomas leaned forward, curiosity piqued. "I'm listening." Sergeant served 3 tours in Afghanistan with his handler, Staff Sergeant Robert Hammond. They were part of an IED detection unit, one of the best. Hammond was... Delgado paused, searching for words. "He was something of a legend among those of us who worked with military dogs. He had a way with them that most handlers only dream about." "And you served with them?" Thomas asked. "My unit worked alongside theirs during my second tour. I was there the day Hammond and Sergeant saved 27 lives, including mine." Delgado absently touched the scar on his face. "An insurgent compound we thought was cleared wasn't. Hammond and Sergeant were doing a final sweep when Sergeant alerted to explosives we'd missed. Instead of retreating, they pushed forward to give the rest of us time to evacuate." Thomas felt a chill despite the warm coffee shop. "What happened?" "The building partially collapsed. Hammond was severely injured. Sergeant stayed with him, barking, until rescue arrived despite being injured himself." Delgado's expression darkened with the memory. Hammond lost his left leg below the knee. Sergeant had shrapnel wounds and a spinal injury that nearly paralyzed him. The doctors wanted to euthanize him, but Hammond refused. "So they both survived," Thomas said, trying to piece together the timeline. Delgado nodded. "Hammond was medically discharged. He fought to adopt Sergeant rather than leave him in military service, given his injuries. They moved back here. Hammond was from Nebraska originally. That was about 5 years ago." "And you've been looking for them?" Delgado reached into his pocket and removed a small velvet box. "For 3 years. Hammond disappeared off the grid, changed his phone, moved without leaving a forwarding address. I had something that belonged to him, something important that he earned but never received." He opened the box to reveal a Purple Heart medal. Hammond was awarded this posthumously for action in Afghanistan, except he didn't die there. The military made a clerical error that wasn't discovered until after he'd been discharged. By then, he'd vanished. Some of us from the unit pooled resources to hire a private investigator, but Hammond was good at not being found. Thomas stared at the medal, the magnitude of what he was hearing slowly sinking in. So our dog belonged to a war hero who never received recognition for his service. Hammond wouldn't have cared about the medal, Delgado said with certainty. But the recognition mattered to those of us he saved. We wanted him to know he wasn't forgotten. Thomas thought of the elderly German shepherd who had appointed himself Emma's guardian, who performed security sweeps of their home by instinct, who carried himself with the dignity of a soldier despite his failing body. Why would Hammond disappear? Like that? Go off the grid? Delgado sighed heavily. PTSD. Severe, according to the VA records we found. He struggled with reintegration, the loss of his leg, the nightmares, the hypervigilance. It's not an uncommon story for veterans. Sargent was his lifeline, his service dog helping him manage the symptoms. Without Sargent, he let the implication hang in the air. How? Did Sargent end up at the auction then, if they were so connected? Delgado wants our help understanding what happened to Hammond. He thinks Sargent might recognize places or people connected to Hammond's last days. Rebecca's nurse's instincts surfaced immediately. Is this safe, Thomas? If Hammond really did die under suspicious circumstances, do we want to get involved? We have Emma to think about. I know, Thomas sighed. That's why I told him I needed to talk to you first. But Becca, Delgado also implied that simply having Sargent might eventually attract attention, whether we help him or not. Rebecca's gaze drifted toward the living room, where Emma's voice rose and fell in the cadence of a story being read aloud. We can't just take him back to the auction. Emma would be devastated. And now we know he's more than just an old dog. He's saved. Lives, Becca, including Delgado's. Rebecca was silent for a long moment, her practical nature warring with her compassion. Finally, she said, "Let's talk to Delgado together. I want to form my own impression." In the living room, they found Emma demonstrating simple arithmetic, to Sargent using colored blocks. The German shepherd watched with remarkable attentiveness, his cloudy eyes following her small hands as she moved the blocks around. And that's how addition works, Emma concluded seriously. Subtraction is harder, but I'll show you tomorrow. How's our girl doing? Thomas asked, smiling despite his inner turmoil. Emma looked up brightly. Sargent is super smart, Dad. He already knows how to sit and stay and come, and he learns things really fast. That's because he had special training, Thomas said, sitting on the couch beside Rebecca. Emma, we need to talk to you about Sargent. Emma's smile faded instantly, her arms going protectively around the dog's neck. We're keeping him, right? You promised. We're keeping him, Rebecca assured her quickly. But we've learned some important things about Sargent's past that you should know. With carefully chosen words, they explained that Sargent had been a military dog who helped soldiers in Afghanistan, that his former owner had been a hero who saved many lives, and that Captain Delgado had served with them. Emma's eyes widened as she processed this information. So, Sargent is a real hero, not just a service dog? Both, Thomas confirmed, and Captain Delgado wants to visit with Sargent. Would that be okay with you? Emma considered this seriously. Will he take Sargent away? No, sweetie. Sargent is our dog now. But Captain Delgado knew Sargent's owner, and he'd like to understand what happened to him. Emma looked down at Sargent, who had remained calmly attentive throughout the conversation. Did Sargent's owner die? She asked with the direct perception children sometimes display. Thomas nodded gently. Yes. His name was Robert Hammond, and he was a soldier who was injured saving other soldiers. Sargent helped him. Emma processed. This, her young face solemn. Then she made a decision with the clarity only children possess. We should help Captain Delgado. Sargent would want to help his first owner. Right, Sargent! At the sound of his name, Sargent's ears perked forward. He looked directly at Emma as if understanding every word, then turned his gaze to Thomas and Rebecca with an intelligence that continued to unsettle them. We're thinking about it, Rebecca said carefully. Captain Delgado is coming over this evening so we can talk more. Emma nodded, satisfied. I'll tell Sargent about it. He listens really well. That afternoon, Rebecca took Sergeant to the local veterinarian while Thomas prepared for his summer school classes. Dr. Westfield, a Vietnam veteran himself and the town's only veterinarian for 30 years, conducted a thorough examination of the German Shepherd. "Remarkable animal," he commented as he checked Sergeant's eyes. "Military working dog, you said." Rebecca explained what they'd learned from Delgado. "We're concerned about his overall health, given his age and background." Dr. Westfield nodded, thoughtfully. "The arthritis in his hips is significant, but manageable with proper medication. The cataracts are advancing, but not severe enough to justify surgery at his age. His heart sounds strong, though he's underweight. Proper nutrition should resolve that." He ran his hands over Sergeant's body with professional precision. "These scars tell quite a story. Shrapnel wounds, if I had to guess. Consistent with the history you described." "That's what I can't understand," Delgado admitted. "Hammond would never willingly be separated from Sergeant. When I heard about Hammond's death and then found Sergeant at the auction, it doesn't add up. Hammond had no family, according to our research. His parents died years ago, no siblings." Thomas processed this information, trying to reconcile the dignified dog in his home with this history of heroism and tragedy. "Captain Delgado." "Marcus, please." "Marcus, I appreciate you sharing this with me, but I'm still not clear on what you're hoping for here. Sergeant is legally ours now, and my daughter is already deeply attached to him." "I'm not here to reclaim Sergeant," Delgado assured him quickly. "He deserves a loving home for whatever time he has left, but I would like to understand what happened to Hammond, how he died, why Sergeant ended up at auction, and..." He hesitated. "I'd like to give Sergeant a chance to visit Hammond's grave. Dogs grieve too, Mr. Wilson. He deserves closure." Thomas considered the request. It seemed reasonable, even compassionate. Yet something about Delgado's intensity suggested there was more to the story than he was sharing. "There's something else, isn't there?" Thomas asked directly. Delgado studied his coffee cup for a long moment before meeting Thomas's gaze. "Hammond sent me a letter about 8 months ago. No return address, postmarked from this county. It was concerning. He mentioned threats, people watching him. Said that if anything happened to him, I should find Sergeant. You think his death wasn't natural?" "I think there are unanswered questions," Delgado said carefully. "The timing of his death, Sergeant ending up at auction, the letter. It feels wrong." Thomas sat back in his chair, the weight of this new information settling uncomfortably. What had seemed like a simple act of charity, his daughter rescuing an elderly dog, was rapidly evolving into something far more complex. "What exactly are you asking me to do, Marcus?" "Help me understand what happened to Hammond. Let me spend some time with Sergeant. He might recognize places, people connected to Hammond's last days. Military dogs have exceptional memory and intelligence, and Sergeant was special, even among working dogs." Thomas thought of Emma, of how quickly she had bonded with the German Shepherd, of the protective presence the dog had established in their home overnight. He thought of Rebecca's caution and her compassion. He thought of the responsibility they had unknowingly taken on when Emma emptied her piggy bank at the auction. "I need to discuss this with my wife," he finally said. "This is more complicated than buying a family pet." Delgado nodded in understanding. "Of course, family comes first." He wrote his cell number on a napkin. "Call me when you've decided. But Mr. Wilson, Thomas, I should warn you, if Hammond's concerns in his letter were legitimate, being in possession of Sergeant might eventually attract unwanted attention. Whether you help me or not, you should be vigilant." Thomas drove home with his thoughts in turmoil. The morning. Sun casting deceptively cheerful patterns through the windshield of his station wagon. What had begun as a simple act of kindness, allowing his daughter to rescue an elderly dog, had transformed into something far more complicated. a war hero's service animal, a mysterious death, potential threats, and now his family was. Somehow, in the middle of it all, when he pulled into the driveway of their modest two-story home, Thomas sat for a moment, gathering himself before facing Rebecca with this new information. Through the living room window, he could see Emma sitting on the floor, apparently reading to Sergeant, who lay attentively beside her. Rebecca met him at the door, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "How did it go?" she asked, quietly leading him to the kitchen where they could speak privately. Thomas leaned against the counter, arranging his thoughts. "It's complicated." He recounted his conversation with Delgado, watching Rebecca's expression shift from skepticism to concern as the story unfolded. "A Purple Heart," she whispered, "and the handler died under suspicious circumstances." Thomas nodded. "According to Delgado, anyway. I don't know what to make of it all, Becca. Part of me thinks it could be an elaborate story, but the dog's training is real," Rebecca finished for him. "I've been watching him all morning. The way he positions himself between Emma and the windows, how he checks the doors whenever there's a noise outside. Those aren't coincidences." "So he's healthy enough to stay with us?" Rebecca asked. "My daughter is already deeply attached. With proper care, he could have several good years ahead," Dr. Westfield assured her. "I'll prescribe medication for the arthritis pain and recommend a feeding schedule to safely increase his weight. But Mrs. Wilson," he lowered his voice, though Sergeant was the only other presence in the room, "you should be aware that dogs like this, with his training and background, are different. Their perception, their intelligence, their loyalty. It's beyond what you see in ordinary pets." "We've noticed," Rebecca admitted, "the way he watches over Emma, how he checks our home for security. Those behaviors are hardwired now," the vet explained. "He won't stop being a working dog just because he's retired. And from what you've told me about his former handler, these military teams develop bonds that transcend conventional understanding. He may still be processing the loss." Rebecca thought about Emma reading to Sergeant that morning, how the dog had watched her daughter with such focused attention. "He's already forming a new bond with Emma." Dr. Westfield smiled slightly. "That doesn't surprise me. Children often connect with these dogs in unique ways, the simplicity and honesty of their emotions. But Mrs. Wilson, if you're concerned about the circumstances of how this dog came into your possession, you should trust those instincts." "What do you mean?" "Military working dogs, especially those assigned to handlers with PTSD, don't typically end up in county auctions when their handlers pass away. There are protocols, organizations that specialize in rehoming these animals. The fact that this dog was treated as ordinary property in an estate sale raises questions." He finished his examination and helped Sergeant down from the table. Questions someone might want answered. Rebecca's nursing instincts heightened at the veiled warning. "Dr. Westfield, did you know Robert Hammond? He lives somewhere in the county." The veterinarian's expression shifted subtly. "Hammond? Yes. I treated Sergeant a few times over the past years. Kept to himself mostly. Lived out past the old Miller property, if I recall correctly. Paid in cash, never left contact information beyond what was necessary. He wrote out prescriptions while speaking. Dedicated to this dog, though. Wouldn't leave him alone in the examination room. Insisted on being present for every procedure, every moment." "When was the last time you saw them?" Dr. Westfield considered. "This. About 6 months ago." Hammond seemed tense, more vigilant than usual, which was saying something. "Kept checking the windows of my waiting room." He handed Rebecca the prescriptions. "Mrs. Wilson, veterans like Hammond, they sometimes see threats where none exist. PTSD can distort perception, but occasionally," he paused meaningfully, "occasionally their hypervigilance is warranted." Rebecca left the veterinary clinic with more questions than answers, and a growing sense of unease. Sergeant walked beside her with perfect leash manners, occasionally scanning their surroundings with professional attention that seemed at odds with his elderly condition. At home, they found Emma had converted her child-sized tent in the backyard into what she called Sergeant's Command Center, complete with his bed, water bowl, and several of her stuffed animals for company. "He can see everything from here, Mom," Emma explained seriously, "and it's shady, so he won't get too hot." Rebecca watched as Sergeant inspected the tent thoroughly before settling inside with dignified acceptance. The contrast between her daughter's innocent play and the complex reality of the dog's background created a strange dissonance. By early evening, Thomas had called Delgado and arranged for him to visit after dinner. Emma insisted on helping prepare the meal, explaining to Sergeant each step of making spaghetti with the patient detail of a cooking show host. The German Shepherd remained attentive throughout, occasionally glancing toward the windows with professional interest that never quite became alarm. Delgado arrived precisely at 7, now dressed in casual clothes that still somehow projected military precision. He carried a small leather satchel and greeted Emma with sincere respect that clearly delighted her. "Thank you for allowing me to visit," he said to Rebecca and Thomas as they settled in the living room. "I understand your concerns about my interest in Sergeant." Emma had positioned herself on the floor beside Sergeant, one small hand resting protectively on his shoulder. "Captain Delgado, were you a dog soldier too?" she asked. "No, not exactly," he smiled. "I was a Marine like Sergeant Hammond, but I worked with communications, radios and such. Sergeant here was what we call a specialized detection dog. He could find dangerous things hidden underground that might hurt soldiers." Emma's eyes widened. "Like treasure hunting." "A bit like that," Delgado agreed gently, "but for things that weren't treasures." "Bombs," Emma said with surprising directness. "My friend Tyler's dad lost his leg from a bomb. He has a robot leg now." Delgado's expression softened. "Sergeant Hammond lost his leg too, but he had Sergeant here to help him afterward." Rebecca intervened, aware of the conversation's gravity. "Captain Delgado, you mentioned concerns about Hammond's death. Can you elaborate?" Delgado opened his satchel and removed a folder. "About 8 months ago, I received this letter from Hammond. It was the first contact I'd had with him in nearly 3 years. He handed the letter to Thomas, who read it with Rebecca looking over his shoulder. The handwriting was tight and controlled, the content brief but disturbing. Hammond described being watched, mentioned them finding what they're looking for, and urged Delgado to locate Sergeant if anything happened to him. The letter ended abruptly with, "Some secrets don't stay buried," literally. "What does this mean?" Thomas asked, returning the letter. "What secrets?" "That's what I've been trying to understand," Delgado admitted. Hammond and Sergeant were involved in some classified operations during their final deployment. Nothing beyond standard military operations, but they did discover something significant during an IED clearing mission near Kandahar. Something that was quietly handled by intelligence officers. "And you think that's connected to his death?" Rebecca asked skeptically. "I don't know," Delgado said honestly. "It could be paranoia from PTSD. Hammond struggled after returning home. The physical injuries, the psychological trauma. It changes a person. But the timing troubles me. This letter, then his death, months later, Sergeant ending up at auction." During this conversation, Sergeant had been watching Delgado with unwavering attention. Now, as the Marine mentioned the auction, the German Shepherd rose stiffly and approached the coffee table where the letter lay. He sniffed it deliberately, then looked up at Delgado with an intensity that silenced everyone in the room. "He recognizes Hammond's scent," Delgado said softly. Even after all this time, Emma watched this interaction with solemn understanding. Beyond her years, "Sergeant misses him," she said simply. Delgado nodded. "I believe he does." which is why I was hoping you might allow me to take Sergeant to visit Hammond's grave, and perhaps to see his home. Dogs process loss differently than humans, but they do grieve. It might help him understand what happened to his handler, Thomas. And Rebecca exchanged glances, silently communicating their thoughts, as parents often do. Finally, Thomas spoke. "We're not comfortable with you taking Sergeant alone, but we could accompany you. As a family." "That seems reasonable," Delgado agreed. "According to the information I've gathered, Hammond was buried in Riverside Cemetery on the edge of town. As for his property, the auction listing mentioned it was located off County Road 27, but I haven't been able to pinpoint the exact location." "Dr. Westfield mentioned Hammond lived past the old Miller property," Rebecca offered. "That would be in that area." Emma had been listening intently, her small face serious. "Sergeant should bring flowers," she declared. "People bring flowers when they visit graves." Her innocent compassion momentarily softened the tension in the room. "That's a lovely thought, Emma," Rebecca said gently. "Perhaps this weekend," Delgado suggested. "Saturday morning for the cemetery visit?" They agreed on the plan, and as Delgado prepared to leave, he knelt to Sergeant's level. "It's good to see you again, old friend," he said quietly. "We're going to figure this out." Sergeant held the Marine's gaze with uncanny understanding, his tail offering a single, deliberate wag that seemed more acknowledgement than affection. After Delgado departed, Emma insisted on another bedtime story for Sergeant before being persuaded to sleep in her own bed. The German Shepherd once again positioned himself strategically in the hallway where he could monitor both Emma's room and the stairs leading to the first floor. "What do you make of all this?" Rebecca asked Thomas as they prepared for bed themselves. Thomas shook his head, uncertain. "I don't know what to believe. Delgado seems genuine, but the implications are disturbing. That we might have inadvertently involved ourselves in something dangerous." "We could still back out," Rebecca suggested without conviction. "Tell Delgado we've changed our minds." "And then what? Return Sergeant to an uncertain fate?" Emma would be heartbroken. And if there's any truth to Hammond's concerns, simply having Sergeant might already have complicated matters. Rebecca sighed, acknowledging the reality of their situation. "I've been thinking about what Dr. Westfield said about military dogs and their connections to their handlers. The way Sergeant responded to Hammond's letter, it was remarkable," Thomas agreed, "as if he understood exactly what we were discussing." "What if he did?" Rebecca posed the question that had been forming in her mind all evening. "Thomas, what if Sergeant knows more about Hammond's death than anyone realizes? What if that's why he ended up at auction, to keep him away from someone who might recognize what he understands?" Thomas considered this perspective, unsettled by its implications. "You're suggesting Sergeant is somehow a witness?" "I'm suggesting we shouldn't underestimate him," Rebecca clarified. "Military working dogs are trained to observe, to remember, to recognize patterns and threats. If Hammond's death wasn't natural..." She left the thought unfinished, but its weight remained between them as they turned out the lights. In the hallway, Sergeant maintained his vigilant posture, occasionally scanning the darkened house with senses far more acute than his human family's, listening, watching, remembering. Unknown to the Wilsons, a dark sedan drove slowly past their home for the third time that night. Its occupant, noting the presence of lights and movement within the modest two-story house where an extraordinary dog had found unexpected sanctuary. The following days established a new routine in the Wilson household. Emma, suddenly responsible, beyond her years, managed Sergeant's arthritis medication with careful attention to Dr. Westfield's instructions. She maintained a notebook documenting his meals, medications, and behaviors with meticulous 7-year-old handwriting that improved with each entry. For his part, Sargent adapted to family life with remarkable ease, while never abandoning his service dog vigilance. He accompanied Emma everywhere household rules permitted, positioned himself strategically during family meals, and continued his subtle security checks of the property with methodical precision that both impressed and unsettled the adults. Thursday morning brought Thomas's first summer school class, leaving Rebecca to work from home while supervising Emma and Sargent. She spread her nursing paperwork across the kitchen table, occasionally glancing into the backyard where Emma had created an elaborate obstacle course for Sargent using garden chairs, cardboard boxes, and jump ropes. "Go slow, buddy," Emma encouraged, as the German Shepherd navigated between two lawn chairs with deliberate care. "You don't have to hurry." Rebecca smiled at her daughter's nurturing instincts, then returned to her charting. Minutes later, the distinctive sound of a vehicle stopping outside their house drew her attention. Through the kitchen window, she observed a county sheriff's patrol car parked along the curb. Deputy Martin Hayes, a fixture in their small community, for over 20 years, approached their front door with the unhurried confidence of rural law enforcement. "Morning, Rebecca," he greeted her when she opened the door. Martin had coached Thomas in high school baseball decades earlier and had known Rebecca since her nursing school days. His weathered face creased with familiar lines as he removed his hat. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Just catching up on paperwork," she assured him, gesturing toward the kitchen. "Coffee?" Wouldn't say no. He followed her inside, settling his considerable frame onto a kitchen chair with a sigh that spoke of long hours and aging joints. "Heard you folks adopted a dog recently." Rebecca's nursing instincts detected the casual question as something more purposeful. "Emma rescued a German Shepherd from the county auction last weekend," she confirmed, placing a mug of coffee before him. "Why do you ask?" Martin added sugar to his coffee with deliberate movements. "Just following up on some paperwork. The dog came from the Hammond estate sale, correct? Robert Hammond lived out on County Road 27. That's right. Is there a problem with the adoption?" "Not exactly." Martin stirred his coffee longer than necessary. "I'm just trying to tie up some loose ends regarding Hammond's death. Standard procedure." Rebecca's internal alarms activated at the deputy's careful phrasing. "I thought Hammond died of natural causes. At least, that's what we understood from the auction listing." Martin studied her expression before responding. "That was the initial determination. Heart attack, according to the paramedics who responded. But we never located any next of kin to claim personal effects or confirm medical history. The county handled the estate liquidation after the standard waiting period." Before Rebecca could formulate a response, the back door opened as Emma led Sargent inside, both pausing when they noticed the uniformed visitor. Sargent's reaction was immediate and pronounced. His posture stiffened, ears fully alert, eyes fixed on Martin with an intensity that transcended casual interest. "Well, hello there, young lady." Martin greeted Emma with practiced joviality that didn't quite reach his eyes. "This must be your new friend." Emma moved closer to Sargent, picking up on his sudden alertness. "This is Sargent. He's a hero dog from Afghanistan." Martin's gaze shifted to the German Shepherd, studying him with new interest. "Is that right? Military working dog, then?" "He helped soldiers find bombs," Emma stated proudly. "And his owner was a hero who saved lots of people." "Emma, why don't you get Sargent some water?" Rebecca suggested, sensing the subtle tension in the room. "He's probably thirsty after your obstacle course." Once Emma had moved to the sink with Sargent following. Closely, Martin lowered his voice. "Military dog, huh? Don't see those at county auctions typically." "We've been wondering about that ourselves," Rebecca admitted, deciding transparency might yield more information than evasion. "It seems unusual that a trained service animal would be handled that way after his owner's death." Martin nodded thoughtfully. Hammond was something of a recluse. Moved here about 5 years back, kept to himself. Few interactions with local law enforcement. Mostly just checking in as a courtesy to let us know he had service-related PTSD and a trained dog. He sipped his coffee. Nobody really knew him well enough to handle things differently when he passed. Rebecca watched as Emma carefully filled Sergeant's water bowl, the dog maintaining vigilant attention on Martin even while accepting the drink. Deputy Hayes, is there something specific about Hammond or Sergeant that brought you here today? This doesn't feel like routine follow-up. Martin's weathered face revealed nothing, but his delayed response spoke volumes. Just crossing T's and dotting E's, Rebecca. Hammond's property is finally being listed for sale after the estate closing. Realtor found some irregularities during the final inspection. Military documentation secured areas on the property. Nothing illegal, just unusual enough that the sheriff asked me to follow up with anyone connected to Hammond. We didn't know him, Rebecca clarified. We only acquired Sergeant through the auction. Of course, Martin acknowledged, finishing his coffee. But sometimes animals, especially trained ones like this, might lead us to better understanding of their owners. Mind if I say hello to him? Rebecca hesitated briefly before nodding. Emma, Deputy Hayes would like to meet Sergeant properly. Emma looked uncertainly between her mother and the deputy before murmuring something to Sergeant and approaching with the dog, maintaining perfect heel position beside her. Martin set his coffee mug down and turned in his chair to face them directly. "May I?" he asked Emma, extending his hand slowly toward Sergeant. "He doesn't like sudden movements," Emma warned with surprising authority. "You have to let him sniff you first." Martin's lips twitched in what might have been amusement as he followed these instructions, holding his hands steady for Sergeant's inspection. The German shepherd sniffed deliberately, his attention utterly focused on the deputy. For a moment, the kitchen was silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock. Then Sergeant did something unexpected. He backed up 2 precise steps and positioned himself between Emma and Martin, his posture communicating neither aggression nor welcome, merely watchful assessment. "Smart boy," Martin commented, withdrawing his hand. "Good protective instincts." "He's not being protective," Emma corrected with childish certainty. "He's remembering." Martin's expression sharpened. "Remembering what, Emma?" "You," she said simply. "Sergeant recognizes people he's met before. That's what Dad says." Martin and Rebecca exchanged glances, the deputy's expression unreadable. "I've never met this dog before today," he stated carefully. "Then maybe he met someone who smells like you," Emma suggested, the innocent observation landing with unexpected weight in the silent kitchen. Martin stood, placing his hat back on with deliberate movements. "Thank you for the coffee, Rebecca. If you folks notice anything unusual about the dog's behavior, or if he leads you to anything interesting, I'd appreciate a call." He produced a business card from his shirt pocket. "Direct line, anytime." Rebecca accepted the card, certain, now that Martin's visit had purposes beyond routine follow-up. Of course, though I'm not sure what a retired military dog would show us, that would be of interest to the sheriff's department. Martin paused at the door, his gaze returning to Sergeant, who had not relaxed his vigilant stance. "You'd be surprised what these animals understand, what they remember." Hammond used to say his dog was smarter than most people he knew. Might have been right. With a final nod, he departed, his patrol car lingering in front of their house for several minutes before finally pulling away. When Thomas returned home that afternoon, Rebecca recounted the deputy's visit while Emma worked on an art project in the living room, Sergeant lying attentively beside her. "He didn't say anything about investigating Hammond's death," Thomas noted, troubled by the implications. "Just irregularities at the property?" "It felt like he was fishing for information," Rebecca agreed. "And Sergeant's reaction to him was pronounced." Thomas glanced toward the living room. "What did Delgado say about Sergeant's training? That he was a specialized detection dog?" Could he possibly recognize someone connected to Hammond? Emma seemed to think so. Rebecca lowered her voice further. Thomas, I'm starting to wonder if we've stumbled into something more serious than we realized. First Delgado with his concerns, now the sheriff's department showing sudden interest in a supposedly natural death. Before Thomas could respond, Emma appeared in the doorway, Sergeant beside her. Dad, I need to show you something. It's important. Thomas exchanged glances with Rebecca before following Emma into the living room. Spread across the coffee table was not the art project they had anticipated, but a carefully arranged display of objects. Sergeant's service vest, which Emma had apparently been cleaning, several photographs printed from the internet showing military, working dogs in Afghanistan, and a crude map drawn in crayon showing their house, the town center, and a road leading to what Emma had labeled Sergeant's old home. What's all this, sweetheart? Thomas asked, kneeling beside the coffee table. Sergeant's trying to tell us something, Emma stated with absolute conviction. He keeps doing this thing with his vest, pushing it with his nose and looking at us. And he gets really excited when I show him pictures of Afghanistan. She pointed to the map. And he really wants to go here. I think it's important. Thomas looked at Sergeant, who sat watching them with that unsettling intelligence, then at Rebecca, who had followed them into the room. Emma, honey, how do you know he wants to go to Hammond's house? Because every time we go in the car, he looks that direction, Emma explained as if it were obvious. And he gets really alert, like when he's checking the house for bad guys. Plus, when Deputy Hayes was here talking about the house, Sergeant's ears did this. She demonstrated by holding her hands beside her head, fingers pointed upward. The adults might have dismissed these observations as childish imagination, if not for Sergeant's current demeanor. Utterly focused, alert without being alarmed, his attention moving between Emma and her display with evident purpose. We should call Captain Delgado, Emma concluded. Sergeant wants to go home, and I think it's because there's something important there, something that will help us understand why his first owner died. Thomas was struck by his daughter's articulation of exactly what had been forming in his own mind. Emma had connected the pieces with the straightforward logic of childhood, unburdened by adult skepticism. We were planning to visit the cemetery on Saturday, Rebecca reminded them. Perhaps we could drive by Hammond's property afterward, just to see if Sergeant shows any recognition. Thomas nodded slowly, studying the German shepherd, who maintained his attentive position beside Emma. I'll call Delgado tonight, see what he thinks. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Thomas and Rebecca sat on the back porch discussing the day's events in hushed tones. Sergeant had taken up his now customary position in the hallway outside Emma's room, but remained visible through the open door. Delgado seemed concerned when I mentioned Deputy Hayes's visit, Thomas reported, keeping his voice low. Said he'd meet us at the cemetery as planned, but suggested we be careful about discussing our plans openly. You think our phones might be monitored? Rebecca asked incredulously. Thomas, that sounds paranoid. 3 days ago, I would have agreed with you, he admitted. But Hammond's letter to Delgado, the deputy's unexpected visit, Sergeant's reactions, something doesn't add up. Rebecca was silent for a moment, processing these concerns against her naturally practical nature. If, and this is a big if, Hammond's death wasn't natural, and if it's somehow connected to his military service, why would local law enforcement be involved? I don't know, Thomas confessed. But Delgado mentioned that Hammond discovered something during his final deployment, something that intelligence officers took interest in. What if that something isn't as buried as they'd like it to be? And what could possibly connect Afghanistan to our small town in Nebraska? Rebecca countered. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft sound from inside the house. Sergeant had appeared in the doorway, his posture alert but not alarmed. He approached them deliberately, something clutched gently in his mouth. What have you got there, boy? Thomas asked, reaching out slowly. Sergeant deposited the object in Thomas's hand, a small metal tag that had apparently been attached to his service vest. The tag bore a series of numbers and letters, followed by a designation, SDC 117 JTF CIED. "What is this?" Rebecca whispered, examining the tag. "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "But I think Sergeant just answered your question about connections between Afghanistan and Nebraska." Friday dawned with a heavy summer rain that drummed against the windows and transformed the backyard into a series of muddy puddles. The inclement weather confined Emma and Sergeant to indoor activities, which Emma approached with characteristic determination. She had created what she called Sergeant's Memory Book, a scrapbook filled with drawings of Afghanistan based on internet images, notes about military working dogs copied carefully from websites, and several pages left intentionally blank for when we learn more about his adventures. Rebecca appeared from the kitchen, concern evident beneath her polite smile. "Hello, I'm Rebecca Wilson, Thomas's wife." Diana nodded in greeting before turning back to Thomas. "Mr. Wilson, given Sergeant's unique background, the VA would be willing to offer comprehensive support for his ongoing care, specialized veterinary services, medications, even potential placement with another veteran who might benefit from his specific training." The offer, presented as generosity, struck Thomas as something altogether different, an attempt to regain custody of Sergeant. "That's very kind," he responded carefully, "but we're managing his care well, and as I mentioned, my daughter is deeply bonded with him already." Diana's expression remained pleasant, though her eyes hardened slightly. "Of course, just know the offer stands should circumstances change." She opened her portfolio and produced a business card. "My direct line, should you have any questions or concerns about his care." From the living room doorway, Emma appeared with questioning eyes, immediately moving to Sergeant's side. "Is everything okay, Dad?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart," Thomas assured her. "Ms. Welch here is just checking to make sure Sergeant is happy with us." Emma looked directly at the visitor, her small face serious. "He is happy. He protects us, and we take care of him, just like he did for Mr. Hammond." Something flickered across Diana's face, surprise perhaps, or calculation. "You know about his former handler?" "We're learning," Emma replied with disarming honesty. "Sergeant remembers him. We're going to visit his grave tomorrow, so Sergeant can say goodbye properly." Thomas fought to keep his expression neutral as Emma innocently revealed their plans. Diana Welch nodded with a smile that never reached her eyes. "That's very thoughtful of you," she said. "Well, I can see Sergeant is in good hands. Thank you for your time, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson." She moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at the German Shepherd. These special animals form remarkable bonds. Their loyalty can last beyond all reasonable expectations. With that cryptic observation, she departed, hurrying through the rain to her sedan. Thomas watched through the window as she sat in her car for several minutes, apparently making a phone call before finally driving away. "I don't think she was really from the VA," Emma stated matter-of-factly once the car had disappeared. Thomas turned to his daughter in surprise. "What makes you say that?" "Sergeant didn't trust her," Emma explained. "He does this thing with his ears when he doesn't trust someone. And she called him by his number, not his name. Mr. Hammond would never do that." Rebecca and Thomas exchanged glances, once again struck by their daughter's perceptiveness. "Emma, how do you know what Mr. Hammond would do?" Rebecca asked gently. Emma shrugged. "Sergeant tells me things, not with words, but I can tell." She knelt beside the German Shepherd, who had maintained his vigilant posture throughout. "He's worried now. He thinks the lady might make trouble." The simplicity of Emma's assessment cut through the adult's more complicated analysis. Whether through extraordinary empathy or genuine connection with the dog, Emma had articulated exactly what they both were feeling. "I think we should call Captain Delgado," Thomas decided. "Let him know about this visit." As Rebecca took Emma back to her drawing project, Thomas stepped onto the back porch, where the rain provided cover for his conversation. Delgado answered on the second ring, his voice instantly alert. "Someone from the VA visited," Thomas reported without preamble. "Diana Welch. She knew Sergeant's designation number, SDC 117. Delgado's silence spoke volumes before he finally responded. "Thomas, there's no Diana Welch registered with the VA office serving your region. I just checked their personnel directory yesterday." Then who was she? Thomas had researched the tag Sergeant had brought them, discovering that JITF SEED stood for Joint Improvised Threat Defeat Organization, formerly the Joint IED Defeat Organization, a military initiative focused on countering improvised explosive devices. The significance of SDC 117 remained unclear, though Delgado might know more. Around mid-morning, as Rebecca prepared lunch and Thomas graded papers at the kitchen table, the doorbell rang. Through the rain-streaked window, Thomas could make out a dark sedan parked at the curb, not Delgado's vehicle, nor Deputy Hayes's patrol car. Sergeant, who had been watching Emma draw in the living room, immediately rose and moved to the front. A door, his posture alert but not alarmed. Thomas approached cautiously, signaling Rebecca to remain with Emma. Opening the door revealed a woman in her early 40s, her professional attire partially concealed beneath a rain jacket. She held a leather portfolio and an umbrella, her expression pleasantly neutral. "Mr. Wilson? Thomas Wilson?" she inquired, her voice carrying the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to authority. "Yes," Thomas confirmed, uncomfortably aware of Sergeant's focused attention on the visitor. "My name is Diana Welch, Department of Veterans Affairs." She presented identification that indeed showed VA credentials. "I'm following up on the adoption of a service animal formerly belonging to Robert Hammond. I understand your family acquired the animal at auction." Thomas's instincts flared with suspicion. 2 official inquiries in 2 days about a supposedly routine animal adoption seemed far beyond coincidence. "That's right," he acknowledged cautiously. "Our daughter participated in the county auction and won the bid for Sergeant." "Sergeant?" The woman's eyebrow lifted slightly. "You've kept his service name, then?" "It seemed appropriate, given his background," Thomas replied, making no move to invite her inside. "Is there a problem with the adoption?" "Not a problem exactly," Diana clarified, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "The VA has protocols for service animals when veterans pass away. Usually they're rehomed through specialized programs, not county auctions. I'm simply verifying that proper procedures were followed and checking on the animal's welfare. We've had him examined by our local veterinarian," Thomas offered. "He's receiving appropriate medication for his arthritis, proper nutrition, and plenty of attention. My daughter has become quite attached to him." "I'm glad to hear it," Diana nodded approvingly. "Would it be possible for me to see him briefly?" "Standard procedure for our records." Thomas hesitated, remembering Delgado's warnings about discussing their plans openly. "Of course," he finally agreed, opening the door wider. "Please come in." Out of the rain. As Diana Welch stepped into the entryway, Sergeant's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Unlike his cautious assessment of Deputy Hayes, the German Shepherd's posture shifted to one of clear recognition and what Thomas could only interpret as wariness. He did not growl or display aggression, but his body language communicated heightened vigilance. "Hello there," Diana greeted the dog with professional warmth, kneeling to his level. "You're looking well, SDC 117. Thomas's attention sharpened at her use of the designation from Sergeant's tag, information he had not shared with her. "You're familiar with Sergeant specifically, Ms. Welch?" "The VA maintains records on all, Service animals provided to veterans, she explained smoothly, rising to her feet without having touched Sergeant, especially those with specialized training backgrounds like this one. I don't know, Delgado admitted, but the fact that she knew his designation code is troubling. That information isn't in standard service dog records. It's specific to his specialized training classification. He paused. Have you noticed? Anyone watching your house? Unfamiliar vehicles? Thomas thought of Deputy Hayes's lingering patrol car. Possibly. What should we do? Change of plans, Delgado decided. I'm driving up tonight instead of tomorrow morning. Don't discuss this. Further on the phone, and keep Sergeant close to your family. I'll explain more when I arrive. The call ended, leaving Thomas standing in the rain with the unsettling realization that their simple act of compassion, rescuing an elderly dog from auction, had drawn them into something far more complex and potentially dangerous than they could have imagined. Inside, Emma continued working on her memory book, unaware of the gathering complications. Sergeant lay beside her, his vigilant eyes occasionally turning toward the windows as the summer rain continued to fall. Thomas spent the afternoon oscillating between checking the windows for unfamiliar vehicles and attempting to maintain a sense of normalcy for Emma's sake. The rain continued steadily, transforming their quiet residential street into a glossy tableau of wet asphalt and blurred streetlights as evening approached. Rebecca, whose practical nature typically balanced Thomas's occasional tendency toward overthinking, seemed equally vigilant, finding reasons to move from room to room, adjusting curtains and checking door locks with casual movements that didn't fool her husband. What time did Delgado say he'd arrive? She asked quietly as they prepared dinner, Emma and Sergeant in the living room watching a nature documentary about wolves that had captured both their attentions. He didn't specify, Thomas replied, keeping his voice low. Just that he was driving. Up tonight instead of tomorrow morning. Rebecca chopped vegetables with precise movements that channeled her anxiety. I keep telling myself we're overreacting, that there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for all of this interest in an elderly service dog. 2 official-seeming visits in 2 days, Thomas reminded her. Deputy Hayes might have been legitimate follow-up, but this VA woman who isn't. Actually, with the VA, I know, Rebecca conceded. I just don't understand what anyone could possibly want with Sergeant that would justify this level of whatever this is. Thomas glanced toward the living room, where Emma was explaining something about pack behavior to Sergeant with the solemn authority of a 7-year-old who had just learned the information herself. Hammond's letter mentioned them finding what they're looking for, and something about secrets not staying buried. What if Sergeant knows where something is hidden, something valuable or sensitive? A dog can't testify or reveal information, Rebecca pointed out. No, but he could lead someone to a location, especially a dog with his specific training. Thomas lowered his voice further. Emma wasn't wrong this morning when she said Sergeant was trying to tell us something. That service tag he brought us wasn't random. Their hushed conversation was interrupted by Sergeant himself, who appeared in the kitchen doorway with alert posture, ears forward, his attention directed toward the front of the house. What is it, boy? Thomas moved toward the hallway, instantly on guard. A moment later, headlights swept across the living room windows as a vehicle pulled into their driveway. Through the rain-streaked glass, Thomas could make out the now familiar outline of Delgado's SUV. Sergeant's posture relaxed slightly, though he maintained vigilant attention as Thomas moved to the front door. Delgado emerged from his vehicle, wearing a rain jacket and carrying a duffel bag, his movements quick and purposeful as he approached the house. Thomas let him in, noting the Marine's careful scan of the street before entering. Any more visitors? Since we spoke, Delgado asked immediately, removing his wet jacket. No, Thomas confirmed, but Sergeant's been on high alert all afternoon. He would be. Delgado nodded grimly. His training included threat assessment. If he sensed something, Was wrong during your visitors' appearances. He'd remain vigilant afterward. Rebecca appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Captain Delgado, what exactly is happening here? Who was this woman claiming to be from the VA, and why is everyone suddenly interested in an elderly service dog? Delgado's expression grew serious. Mrs. Wilson, I believe I haven't been entirely forthcoming about Sergeant's background, partly because I wasn't certain myself until recently. He glanced toward the living room. Perhaps we should speak somewhere your daughter can't overhear. They moved to the kitchen, where Rebecca could continue dinner preparations while they talked. Delgado declined their offer of coffee, but accepted a glass of water, taking a seat at the table where he could see both entrances to the room. Sergeant wasn't just any military working dog, he began, his voice low. His designation, SDC-117, stands for Specialized Detection Canine, Asset 117. He was part of an elite program developing advanced detection capabilities beyond conventional explosives. What does that mean exactly? Thomas asked. It means he was trained to detect things most dogs can't. Chemical precursors, electronic components, even data storage devices. But his most unusual training was in what the military termed forensic detection. Rebecca paused her dinner preparations. Forensic detection. The ability to locate human remains, even years after death, even in extremely challenging environments. Delgado took a sip of water. Hammond and Sargent were deployed to several notorious mass grave sites in Afghanistan. Their work helped identify burial locations that conventional methods missed, evidence that helped build war crimes cases. Thomas thought of the gentle dog who now watched nature documentaries with his daughter. How does this connect to what's happening now, to Hammond's death? During their final deployment, Hammond and Sargent were assigned to an area near Kandahar, where intelligence suggested a high-value target had been eliminated and buried. Their job was to confirm the burial site for DNA testing. Delgado's expression darkened. What they found instead was evidence that the operation hadn't gone as reported. The remains weren't who they were supposed to be. A cover-up? Rebecca asked, the implications dawning on her. Potentially, the details were classified, but Hammond confided some of it to me after we were both stateside. He was troubled by discrepancies in the official reports versus what Sargent had actually found. He submitted his concerns through proper channels and was told the matter was closed. Thomas leaned forward. And you think this is connected to his death 5 years later, here in Nebraska? Hammond never stopped asking questions, Delgado explained. He believed there was a deliberate falsification of intelligence to cover someone's mistake, or worse. After his medical discharge, he continued researching the incident privately, using contacts he'd maintained. His letter to you mentioned people watching him, Rebecca recalled. Yes, Hammond believed he'd found evidence that the high-value target hadn't been eliminated as reported, that the entire operation had been fabricated to close an embarrassing intelligence failure. Delgado looked directly at them. The woman who visited you today wasn't VA. Based on Hammond's descriptions in his communications with me, she matches an intelligence officer who debriefed him after the Kandahar incident. The implications hung heavy in the kitchen air, punctuated by the steady drumming of rain against the windows. You're suggesting U.S. intelligence officers might be involved in Hammond's death? Thomas asked incredulously. That sounds paranoid. Delgado finished for him. I know. I thought the same when Hammond first contacted me after years of silence. But his death so soon after reaching out, Sargent ending up at auction instead of through proper channels, and now these unusual visits. Asking about a seemingly unremarkable elderly dog, he sighed. The coincidences are stacking up. But what could Sargent possibly know that would matter now? Rebecca pressed. Even if everything you're saying is true, what would make him valuable or dangerous years later? Delgado's expression became contemplative. Hammond mentioned in his letter that some secrets don't stay buried, literally. What if he found something? Physical evidence that Sergeant could lead someone to. Their conversation was interrupted by Emma's appearance. In the doorway, Sergeant beside her as always. "The wolf show is over," she announced. "Captain Delgado, are you staying for dinner? I can set an extra place." The adults exchanged glances, silently agreeing to pause their disturbing conversation. "That would be very kind, Emma," Delgado smiled, his severe expression softening for the child's benefit. During dinner, they maintained careful conversation about neutral topics. Emma's school, Thomas's teaching, the community summer festival planned for next month. Sergeant remained positioned between Emma's chair and the dining room entrance, occasionally glancing toward the windows with professional attention that now carried new significance for the adults. After Emma's bedtime routine was complete, with Sergeant once again taking up his position in the hallway outside her room, the adults reconvened in the living room to continue their discussion. "I believe Hammond hid something at his property," Delgado stated without preamble. "Something that could verify his concerns about the Kandahar operation. He was meticulous about documentation. It was part of his military specialty before he became a dog handler." "And you think that's why someone might be watching us now?" Thomas asked. "Because Sergeant could potentially lead to whatever Hammond hid? It's the most logical explanation for this level of interest in an elderly service dog with no other apparent value." Delgado removed a folded paper from his pocket. "I did some research on Hammond's property before driving here. County records show it's 5 acres off County Road 27 with a main house and 2 outbuildings. It was purchased through a limited liability company 5 years ago, shortly after Hammond's medical discharge." Rebecca studied the property information. "And you're suggesting we still visit this property tomorrow, despite the potential risks?" "I'm suggesting we need to understand what Hammond was concerned about," Delgado clarified. "Not just for Sergeant's sake now, but for your families. You've been drawn into this situation through Emma's compassionate act. If there are people watching your home, monitoring your activities because of Sergeant, you deserve to know why." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, the full weight of their situation settling uncomfortably on his shoulders. "So tomorrow we visit the cemetery as planned, then drive by Hammond's property. With caution," Delgado emphasized. "We observe only. If Sergeant shows recognition or unusual behavior, we note it, but don't take action. This isn't about amateur investigation. It's about gathering enough information to determine whether there's legitimate cause for concern, or if Hammond's fears were products of his PTSD." Rebecca, ever practical, asked the question that had been forming since dinner. "And if there is cause for concern, what then?" "Then I have contacts who can help properly. Legitimate channels within the military who would take interest in potential intelligence malfeasance." Delgado's expression was solemn. "But we need something concrete first. Suspicions aren't enough." Their planning was interrupted by a soft sound from the hallway. Sergeant had appeared in the doorway, his posture communicating not alarm, but purpose. He approached Delgado directly, sitting at attention before him with unmistakable focus. "What is it, boy?" Delgado asked softly, instinctively using the tone of a handler addressing a working dog. Sergeant maintained eye contact for a long moment before turning toward the front window, then back to Delgado. The message seemed clear even to Thomas and Rebecca. Something outside required attention. Moving carefully to avoid casting shadows, Thomas approached the front window and peered through a narrow gap in the curtains. The rain had slackened to a gentle drizzle, and the streetlights illuminated a quiet residential scene, except for a dark sedan parked half a block away, its occupant a shadowy silhouette behind rain-streaked windows. "We have company," Thomas reported quietly. Same sedan the VA woman was driving, I think. Delgado joined him at the window, keeping out of direct sightline. They're not even trying to be subtle. It's a message. They want you to know you're being watched. Why? Rebecca asked, her nurse's composure finally showing cracks of genuine alarm. To frighten us away from whatever Hammond was concerned about, or to see what we do in response, Delgado suggested. To determine if we know anything significant. He turned to Sergeant, who maintained his attentive posture. Good boy, good awareness. The German shepherd acknowledged the praise with a single tail movement, his focus unwavering. In that moment, Thomas saw beyond the elderly arthritic companion, who had so quickly become part of their family. He glimpsed the working dog Sergeant had been, highly trained, purpose-driven, exceptional at his duties. We need to adjust our plans, Delgado decided. If they're watching this openly, tomorrow's movements will be monitored. Should we cancel? Rebecca asked. No, but we modify. We proceed with the cemetery visit as planned. That's innocent enough and expected, given what Emma told the visitor today. But afterward, we split up. I'll take Sergeant in my vehicle, supposedly to visit the VA office in Lincoln for official registration. You'll return home with Emma. We'll meet at Hammond's property via different routes. Thomas exchanged concerned glances with Rebecca. That sounds unnecessarily complicated, and I'm not comfortable with Sergeant being separated from us. It's precisely that separation that will be informative, Delgado explained. If they're interested in Sergeant specifically, they'll follow my vehicle. If they're interested in what you might know, they'll follow yours. Either way, it gives uns information. Rebecca's maternal instincts surfaced immediately, and if something goes wrong, if whoever these people are decide to do more than just watch, I'm not suggesting we place anyone at risk, Delgado assured her. Public places only, main roads, no confrontation. At the first sign of anything beyond passive surveillance, we abort and regroup. He looked between them. I understand your concerns. If you want to withdraw completely, I respect that decision. Sergeant could come with me temporarily while I investigate further. The suggestion of separating Sergeant from their family, particularly from Emma, struck Thomas as impossible to consider. In just a few days, the German shepherd had become integral to their household, especially to Emma's sense of security and purpose. No, Thomas decided firmly. We're in this together now, but we proceed with extreme caution, and Emma's safety is the absolute priority. Delgado nodded in understanding. Agreed. Let's work out the details, then try to get some rest. Tomorrow will require clear heads. As they discussed logistics, Sergeant maintained his vigilant presence, occasionally returning to the window to check on the sedan, still parked down the street. His behavior reinforced what Delgado had explained. This was no ordinary service dog, but a highly trained military asset with specialized capabilities that someone apparently still valued greatly. Later, as Thomas and Rebecca prepared for bed, they spoke in hushed tones about the extraordinary situation they found themselves in. I keep thinking we should just call the police, Rebecca admitted. Report being watched, file a complaint. And tell them what? Thomas countered gently. That we suspect intelligence officers might be monitoring us because our daughter's dog might know the location of evidence related to a classified military operation. They'd think we were delusional. Rebecca sat heavily on the edge of their bed. When you put it that way, how did we get here, Thomas? We were just trying to let Emma do something kind for an animal in need. Thomas sat beside her, taking her hand. That's still what we're doing. Sergeant came into our lives for a reason. Emma sensed it immediately, even if we didn't. Whatever Hammond was involved in, whatever Sergeant might know, he deserves to be protected until we understand what's happening. And if understanding puts us at risk. Thomas had no immediate answer for that. Instead, he pulled Rebecca close. both drawing comfort from the familiar embrace while acknowledging the uncertain territory ahead. In the hallway, Sergeant maintained his vigil, occasionally rising to make careful rounds of the house's entry points before returning to his post. Outside Emma's door, his military service might have officially ended years ago, but his sense of duty remained undiminished. Now transferred to the protection of a 7-year-old girl whose act of compassion had given him purpose once again. Outside, the rain finally stopped, stars emerging between scattered clouds. The sedan remained parked down the street, its occupant patient watchful, content to maintain surveillance of the modest home where an extraordinary dog had found unexpected sanctuary, and where a family was slowly discovering they had stumbled into a mystery far larger than they could have imagined. In her bedroom, Emma slept peacefully, untroubled by the adult concerns taking shape around her. Her sergeant's memory book lay open on her nightstand, its pages filled with crayon drawings of heroic dogs and brave soldiers, the innocent perspective of childhood transforming complex realities into simple narratives of courage and loyalty. Whatever tomorrow might bring, whatever secrets Sergeant's past might hold, one truth remained clear. Emma's impulsive act of compassion at a county auction had set in motion events that would test not only her family's courage, but their understanding of loyalty, duty, and the Saturday morning dawned clear and bright. The previous day's rain leaving behind washed skies and glistening lawns throughout the neighborhood. Thomas rose early, checking windows to confirm what Sergeant had already determined. The surveillance sedan had departed sometime during the night. Whether this represented an end to their monitoring or merely a tactical withdrawal remained to be seen. Delgado emerged from the guest room freshly showered, his military precision evident in his efficiently packed duffel bag and perfectly made bed. He accepted the offered coffee with a grateful nod, joining Thomas at the kitchen table where they reviewed their plans for the day in hushed tones. The cemetery visit should proceed normally, Delgado advised. If we're being watched, it's expected. Given what Emma mentioned to the visitor yesterday, it's afterward we need to be careful about. Thomas nodded, glancing toward the ceiling where Emma and Rebecca were still getting ready. I'm still not comfortable with splitting up. It's the safest approach, Delgado insisted. If they're primarily interested in Sergeant, they'll follow my vehicle. You and your family can return home without further involvement. Before Thomas could respond, Emma bounded into the kitchen with the energetic enthusiasm unique to children. On weekend mornings, Sergeant following at a measured pace that nonetheless conveyed his own readiness for the day ahead. We're going to visit Mr. Hammond's grave, she announced, addressing both adults with solemn purpose. I picked flowers from our garden and I made a special card. She produced a folded construction paper creation covered in crayon drawings of Sergeant alongside a stick figure soldier. It says, "Thank you for your service and for Sergeant. We will take good care of him." Do you think that's okay? The adults exchanged glances, momentarily taken aback by the child's straightforward approach to their ostensibly solemn mission. That's perfect, Emma, Thomas assured her, ruffling her unruly red curls. Sergeant needs to say goodbye properly, Emma continued, kneeling to check the German Shepherd's protective boot, which Dr. Westfield had indicated could be removed today. His paw looks much better now, she noted with the serious authority of a self-appointed caretaker. Rebecca joined them, dressed in simple weekend attire, but with an alertness in her expression that belied their seemingly routine family outing. She caught Thomas's eye with a silent question he understood immediately. Had anything changed overnight to alter their plans? Everything's set, he confirmed quietly, as Emma chatted to Sergeant about their upcoming cemetery visit. We'll proceed as discussed. Breakfast passed with forced normalcy, the adults maintaining cheerful conversation that never quite reached their eyes, while Emma remained blissfully absorbed in preparing Sergeant for their important mission. She had tied a simple blue ribbon to his collar, because soldiers wear blue ribbons sometimes, Dad, and carefully brushed his coat until it gleamed despite its age-grade patches. By mid-morning, they were ready to depart. Their plan called for taking both vehicles, the Wilson station wagon and Delgado's SUV, to facilitate the separation after the cemetery visit. As they stepped outside into the bright summer day, Thomas noticed Sergeant perform his now familiar situational assessment, systematically scanning the street, neighboring yards, and visible sightlines before proceeding to the driveway. "He's checking for the car from last night," Emma observed with startling perception. "The one that was watching our house." Thomas exchanged alarmed glances with Rebecca. "What makes you say that, sweetheart?" Emma shrugged with childish nonchalance. "Sergeant kept looking out the window at it last night. I saw when I got up to use the bathroom." She patted the German Shepherd's side. "He's a very good guard dog." This casual revelation of Emma's awareness left the adults momentarily speechless. They had underestimated not only her perception, but her comprehension of the unusual circumstances surrounding their new pet. "Yes, he is," Delgado finally responded, kneeling to Emma's level. "Sergeant was trained to be observant. It's what made him special in Afghanistan. And that's why people are interested in him now," Emma concluded with straightforward logic. "Because he knows important things." Rebecca intervened before this conversation could progress further. "Let's get going, shall we? We want to have plenty of time at the cemetery." They divided into the vehicles, Thomas driving the family station wagon with Rebecca and Emma, Sergeant traveling with Delgado in his SUV to maintain the illusion they were all proceeding to the same destination afterward. As they pulled away from the house, Thomas noted Delgado checking his mirrors with professional diligence, confirming whether their departure had triggered renewed surveillance. Riverside Cemetery occupied a gently sloping hillside on the eastern edge of town, its entrance marked by wrought iron gates and mature oak trees that cast dappled shadows across neatly maintained grounds. Being Saturday morning, several other visitors were present, placing flowers or tending to family plots, a normal weekend activity that provided welcome cover for their visit. They parked near the cemetery office, where Delgado had previously confirmed Hammond's plot location. As they gathered on the sunlit path, Sergeant's demeanor shifted subtly. Still alert, but with a new intensity that suggested recognition or purpose beyond his usual vigilance. "He knows why we're here," Emma whispered to Thomas, holding tightly to her handmade card and the small bouquet of garden flowers Rebecca had helped her arrange. They followed the winding path toward the newer section of the cemetery, passing granite monuments and marble headstones gleaming in the morning light. Delgado led the way, consulting a small map provided by the office while maintaining casual awareness of their surroundings. "There," he indicated finally, pointing toward a simple military headstone in the distance. "Section 12, Plot 47. As they approached Hammond's grave, Thomas noticed Sergeant's pace increasing slightly, his attention now fixed on their destination with unmistakable focus. The headstone was standard military issue, white marble with simple lettering identifying Robert J. Hammond, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Marine Corps, along with his dates of birth and death, and the designation Purple Heart at the bottom. Sergeant reached the grave first, stopping precisely at its foot. For a long moment he simply stood there, his posture reflecting the dignity of a soldier at attention despite his aging body and arthritic joints. The tableau was so striking that all four humans instinctively stopped, allowing the German Shepherd this moment of private recognition. Finally, Emma stepped forward, kneeling beside Sergeant to place her flowers and card at the base of the headstone. "Thank you for being a hero," she said clearly, addressing the grave with the direct sincerity of childhood. "And thank you for Sergeant. We're taking really good care of him, I promise." Thomas felt Rebecca's hand slip into his, squeezing tightly as they witnessed this simple ceremony. Delgado stood slightly apart, his expression revealing complex emotions beneath his controlled exterior. After a respectful silence, he approached the headstone and placed the Purple Heart medal in its case beside Emma's offerings. "Finally delivered, Staff Sergeant," he said quietly, as promised. For several minutes they remained at the gravesite, each absorbed in private thoughts. Sergeant maintained his position at the foot of the grave, occasionally turning his head to scan their surroundings with professional attention that never fully suspended even in this moment of apparent mourning. It was this vigilance that alerted them to approaching footsteps on the cemetery path. Deputy Martin Hayes walked toward them with measured strides, his uniform crisp in the morning sunlight, his expression unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses. "Morning, folks," he greeted them, removing his hat with practiced respect for the cemetery setting. "Thought I might find you here today." Thomas felt Rebecca tense beside him, while Delgado subtly shifted position to place himself between the deputy and the rest of their group. "Good morning, Deputy," Thomas responded, maintaining a casual tone. "Just paying our respects as Emma wanted." Hayes nodded, his gaze moving between the group and the headstone. Hammond was an impressive soldier by all accounts. Not many Purple Heart recipients in our county cemetery. He gestured toward the medal case. "That's new." "Just correcting an administrative oversight," Delgado stated, extending his hand. "Marcus Delgado, Captain USMC, retired. I served with Hammond in Afghanistan." Hayes shook the offered hand, studying Delgado with new interest. "Didn't realize Hammond had military buddies in the area. He kept pretty much to himself these past few years. We'd lost touch," Delgado explained smoothly. "I was trying to reconnect when I learned of his passing." Throughout this exchange, Sergeant had maintained his position at the grave, his attention now divided between the headstone and Deputy Hayes. His posture communicated neither alarm nor ease, merely focused assessment. Emma, who had been quietly watching this adult interaction, suddenly spoke up. "Deputy Hayes, did you know Mr. Hammond?" Hayes turned toward her with a professional smile that softened his weathered features. "Not well, young lady. He didn't come into town much." "But you visited his house," Emma stated, with the directness that continued to startle the adults. "Sergeant remembers you from there." A charged silence followed this declaration, broken only by distant birdsong and the rustling of oak leaves overhead. Hayes removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that assessed Emma with new calculation. "What makes you say that?" he asked, his tone deceptively light. "Sergeant got very alert when you came to our house," Emma explained matter-of-factly. "Like he recognized you but wasn't sure if you were a friend." She looked down at the German shepherd, who had moved closer to her during this conversation. "He's very smart about people." Thomas stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Emma's shoulder. "Kids and their imaginations," he offered with forced lightness. "Emma's convinced Sergeant remembers everything from his past life." Hayes studied them for a long moment before replacing his sunglasses. "Military dogs are exceptional animals. Memory, intelligence, loyalty, they're not like regular pets." He glanced toward Hammond's grave. "I did visit Hammond's property. Occasionally, welfare checks mostly. Veterans with PTSD sometimes need a little extra attention from local authorities." "That's very conscientious," Rebecca commented, her nurse's training evident in her professional tone. "Was he receiving proper VA support?" "Said he preferred handling things himself," Hayes replied. "Independent type." He turned back to Delgado. "You folks planning to visit his property today as well? It's still county managed until the estate finalizes." The direct question confirmed what they had already suspected. Their movements were indeed being monitored. Delgado answered without hesitation, following their predetermined cover story. "I'm headed to the VA office in Lincoln to register Sergeant officially. Proper channels and all that. The Wilsons were kind enough to join me for the cemetery visit first. Hayes nodded, apparently accepting this explanation. Well, I won't keep you from your respects. Just doing my rounds, checking on cemetery security. He replaced his hat with a final glance at Hammond's grave. Enjoy your Saturday, folks. They watched him retreat down the path toward his patrol car parked near the cemetery entrance. Once he was out of earshot, Delgado spoke quietly. We're definitely being monitored. That wasn't a coincidence. He knew we'd be here, Thomas agreed, and he's fishing for our next destination. Rebecca knelt beside Emma, who had returned her. Attention to Sergeant. Sweetheart, why did you tell Deputy Hayes that Sergeant remembered him from Hammond's house? Emma looked up with earnest eyes. Because it's true, Mom. Sergeant did the same thing with his ears and eyes that he did when Captain Delgado first came to our house, like he was remembering someone from before. The adults exchanged troubled glances. Either Emma possessed remarkable intuition about canine behavior, or Sergeant was indeed communicating recognition in ways the child somehow interpreted correctly. We should proceed as planned, Delgado decided. The deputy's appearance confirms they're tracking our movements. The separation strategy is even more important now. They spent a few more minutes at Hammond's grave, maintaining the appearance of a simple memorial visit before walking back toward their vehicles. As they reached the parking area, Delgado knelt to Emma's level. Emma, I need to borrow Sergeant for a little while this afternoon. Is that okay with you? Emma studied him with serious consideration. Are you taking him to Mr. Hammond's house? Delgado hesitated, caught between honesty and protection. I need to take care of some paperwork for him. Military dogs have special registration requirements. Emma's expression made it clear she wasn't entirely convinced by this explanation. He wants to go to the house, she stated with certainty. That's where his important things are. What important things, Emma? Thomas asked gently. The things he's been trying to tell us about, she replied, as if it were obvious. The things people are looking for. She turned to Sergeant, who sat, watching their conversation with alert attention. It's okay. Captain Delgado will take you there, and then you'll come home to us. The uncanny perceptiveness of this statement left the adults momentarily speechless. Delgado recovered first, nodding solemnly to Emma. I promise to bring him back safely. They separated in the cemetery parking lot, the division feeling unnatural, after Sergeant's swift integration into their family unit. As Thomas helped Emma into the station wagon, she leaned down to give Sergeant a fierce hug. Be brave, she whispered into his graying fur. Find what you need to find. The German shepherd responded with uncharacteristic demonstrativeness, pressing his muzzle against her small shoulder for a moment before stepping back to maintain his dignified composure. Thomas exchanged final confirmations with Delgado about their rendezvous plans, a remote access road that approached Hammond's property from the opposite direction of the main entrance, coordinates already programmed into both their phones. Then they departed in separate directions, Thomas driving his family ostensibly toward home, while Delgado headed supposedly toward Lincoln with Sergeant in the passenger seat of his SUV. In the station wagon, Emma watched out the rear window until Delgado's vehicle disappeared from view. He'll be okay, Daddy, she said with surprising conviction. Sergeant knows what to do. I'm sure he does, sweetheart, Thomas agreed, checking his mirrors for any sign of surveillance. He spotted a dark sedan pulling out from a side street. Behind them, not the same vehicle from the previous night, but similar enough to trigger his suspicion. Looks like we might have company, he murmured to Rebecca, who casually checked her side mirror. Same model as last night, different car, she confirmed quietly. Should we change plans? Thomas considered their options. If they were indeed being followed, leading surveillance directly to their planned rendezvous with Delgado could compromise everything. Yet abandoning the plan entirely meant leaving Delgado and Sergeant without backup at Hammond's property. We'll take the scenic route, he decided, making an unexpected turn onto a commercial street lined with Saturday shoppers. Let's see if they're actually following us or if we're being paranoid. The sedan maintained its distance but matched their turn, confirming Thomas's suspicions. For the next 20 minutes, he navigated a circuitous path through town, stopping at a grocery store where Rebecca and Emma briefly went inside while he remained in the parking lot, observing the sedan, now waiting at the periphery. Definitely following us, he told Rebecca when they returned with a small bag of purchases to maintain their cover, but keeping their distance. What do we do? Rebecca asked, her calm exterior belied by the tension in her voice. We can't lead them to Delgado, Thomas reasoned, but we might be able to use this to our advantage. He checked the time, still over an hour before their planned rendezvous. Let's see if we can lose them, then circle back. Emma, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during these developments, suddenly spoke from the back seat. They don't want us, Daddy. They want Sergeant. She looked out the window toward the distant sedan. We should go home like we're supposed to. Captain Delgado and Sergeant need to find the important things by themselves. Once again, Emma's straightforward assessment cut through the adult's more complicated strategic thinking. Thomas met Rebecca's eyes, seeing his own realization reflected there. Their daughter might be right. Perhaps the simplest approach was the most effective. Okay, Emma, he decided. We'll head home as planned. As they pulled out of the parking lot, the sedan resumed its distant pursuit. Thomas drove directly toward their neighborhood, no longer attempting evasive maneuvers. When they turned onto their street, the sedan continued past the intersection, making no attempt to conceal its surveillance, but also not following them all the way to their house. They're just making sure we came home, Rebecca observed as Thomas pulled into their driveway. Which means they're more interested in where Delgado and Sergeant went. Thomas finished her thought, already reaching for his phone. I need to warn him. Inside the house, while Emma settled in the living room with her coloring books, Thomas called Delgado's number. The call went straight to voicemail. Either Delgado had turned off his phone for security reasons, or he was in an area with poor reception. No answer, he reported to Rebecca in the kitchen. We need to decide whether to proceed to the rendezvous point or stay here as originally planned if we were followed. Rebecca weighed their options, her natural caution warring with concern for Delgado and Sergeant. If they were more interested in tracking Sergeant than us, Delgado might be walking into a situation with multiple surveillance teams. Thomas nodded grimly, which means he might need backup, even if just to provide a distraction or an extra set of eyes. Their deliberation was interrupted by Emma appearing in the kitchen doorway, her expression unusually serious. We need to help them, she stated with quiet certainty. Sergeant is trying to show Captain Delgado something important, but the bad people don't want him to find it. Thomas knelt to his daughter's level. What makes you think there are bad people, Emma? Because they're watching our house and following us in their cars, she replied with the clear logic of childhood. Good people don't do that, and Sergeant gets extra alert whenever they're around. Once again, Emma's straightforward assessment aligned perfectly with their own more complex analysis. Thomas exchanged glances with Rebecca, a silent communication passing between them. I should go, he decided. You stay here with Emma. Rebecca shook her head firmly. We stay together. Emma's right, we need to help them, but we go as a family. Emma nodded in solemn agreement. Sergeant would want us all to come. He's protecting all of us, not just me. The simple truth of this statement settled over them, cementing their decision. Whatever mystery surrounded Hammond's death and Sergeant's connection to it, they had become involved as a family. When Emma emptied her piggy bank at the auction, they would face the consequences as a family as well. We leave in 20 minutes, Thomas decided, But at the first sign of trouble, we turn around, no exceptions. As Rebecca helped Emma prepare for their unexpected return journey, Thomas checked windows and sight lines around their property, confirming no visible surveillance remained. The dark sedan had disappeared, presumably following Delgado's vehicle toward Lincoln, or so they hoped. What they couldn't know as they prepared to depart was that Delgado and Sargent had already reached Hammond's property, where the German shepherd's behavior had shifted from alert companion to focused working dog, with a mission that transcended his years and infirmities. Nor could they anticipate what Sargent was about to reveal, a secret buried in the Nebraska soil that would connect a remote Afghan operation to their small Midwestern town in ways that would change their understanding of loyalty, sacrifice, and justice forever. The extraordinary bonds that form between humans and the animals who serve alongside them. As the Wilson family arrived at Hammond's property, they found Sargent digging furiously behind the old shed. Captain Delgado stood watching in amazement as the elderly dog unearthed a waterproof case containing memory cards and classified documents, evidence of a military cover-up that Hammond had discovered. The documents revealed that the high-value target had been an innocent civilian, and Hammond had been silenced to protect powerful officials. The mysterious vehicles converged on the property, but Deputy Hayes unexpectedly arrived to help. He admitted he'd been investigating Hammond's suspicious death himself, suspecting the heart attack had been induced. While Delgado secured the evidence through legitimate military channels, Emma sat with Sargent, who finally relaxed as if knowing his mission was complete. The documents led to prosecutions and official recognition of Hammond's integrity, while the VA woman and her associates faced justice for their role in the cover-up. 6 months later, Emma received a special commendation from the Marine Corps for her role in bringing truth to light. Sargent, now fully recovered and happily integrated into the Wilson family, wore a special medal on his collar during the ceremony. "Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change the world," Emma told reporters. "I just wanted to help a dog who needed me. I didn't know he needed me to help finish his mission." Sargent lived 3 more wonderful years with the Wilsons, peacefully passing in his sleep beside Emma's bed, his duty finally complete. What would you do if an animal came into your life with a purpose beyond what you could imagine? Would you have the courage to follow where they lead? If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and join our channel family. Next week, we'll share another extraordinary tale of courage and connection that will leave you breathless. Until then, remember that sometimes heroes come with 4 paws and an unbreakable spirit.